Hello, and welcome back to the SiteCore Developer Hangouts. It's been some time since we've spoken, and we're glad to have you back. Today, joining me is Adam Conn, this time from our technical product management team.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Adam. And today we're going to be covering a topic that's near and dear to all of us in customer experience, specifically integration and our data exchange framework. We know how important integration is to customer experience management, how critical it is to integrate for customer data, as well as integrate to optimize experience delivery, can determine your success and failure in a customer experience initiative. So with that, we've launched our most recent product, the Data Exchange Framework, and Adam is the master of all things Data Exchange Framework. So first, Adam, why don't you just explain at a high level, what is the Data Exchange Framework?
Okay, at the highest level, the Data Exchange Framework is a product that aims to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to connect different systems for the purpose of sharing data. So SiteCore is probably going to be one of those systems. It may be the source of the data, in which case you want to push data to third-party systems, or it may be the target of the data from third-party systems. So you could push data from third-party systems, or you could have SiteCore pull data from those third-party systems.
Thank you. And so we also know that this isn't our first effort or approach or introduction to integration, nor is it for the audience and our partners. Which really begs the question of what's different about the Data Exchange Framework, and perhaps why now?
So for that, I am going to share my screen. And most of this Hangout is going to be live. It's going to be a demo, but there are a couple of slides that I want to share to just kind of start to answer those questions and give a little bit of context. So the importance of data integration has really been increasing a lot, but it's nothing new. Data integration requirements have been around for a long time. And even if we just look at a couple of the areas where SiteCore has been doing work lately, integration with CRM. We've got contacts from a CRM system, and we want to expose that contact data in SiteCore as XDB contacts. Or for things like video, we've got connector for Brightcove video service. And you would want to be able to use those videos in your SiteCore site and to be able to track video playback. So being able to expose Brightcove videos as SiteCore items is another example of data integration. And one moment, I think we are having some technical difficulties. Still on Nate, okay. Give us just one moment to make sure that I'm able to share my screen correctly. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So you didn't miss much on the slides. So the next example of data integration, if you've been involved with SiteCore and commerce, a lot of times you're going to have your products in a commerce system or in a PIM, and you want to be able to use that product information within SiteCore. So again, exposing third-party data as SiteCore items is another example of data integration. And I'm sure for anybody who has done a couple of SiteCore implementations, you can add more items onto this list. But one of the problems that we were trying to address with this, to answer Nate's question, is that there hasn't been a consistent approach to this. Every project, every product that has some sort of a data integration requirement has done it its own way. And furthermore, new products that are coming out, things like XConnect, are really going to open the floodgates to the need for being able to handle third-party data. So it really is the right time for us to come up with a consistent approach to be able to get data between these different systems. Now, for the data exchange framework itself, since those are some of the problems that we're looking to deal with, we really had 4 goals in mind when we were designing this. First is, like I mentioned, to provide a consistent model for reading, writing, and mapping data. And this, if you're familiar with the term ETL, this is what ETL is all about. And one moment, everyone. So the goal of this for ETL and for being able to read, write, and map data was to have a consistent model that we would be able to use for all of these scenarios that I mentioned in the previous slide, as well as for the different scenarios that you've been dealing with as SiteCore developers. Another goal is to maintain the flexibility of current approaches. I think the fact that there are a variety of different approaches that people are already using for handling data integration is a testament to SiteCore's flexibility as a platform. So we definitely didn't want to take that away from developers. We wanted to have minimal dependency on SiteCore at runtime. If you think about the problem that we're trying to solve, yes, we are trying to solve it from a SiteCore perspective. Either the source system where we're reading the data from or the target system where we're writing data to is most likely going to be SiteCore, but it doesn't have to be. So we really wanted to make sure that we were using SiteCore where it makes sense and only bring SiteCore in when it's necessary. And especially at runtime, when you're actually doing the data exchange, does it make sense for SiteCore to be involved in that? Do you really need a SiteCore server to handle any of that process? Most of the time, the answer is no. So we tried to eliminate any of the dependencies that we have on SiteCore at runtime. And then the 4th goal is we wanted to have a model where somebody could build a connector without being a SiteCore expert. So we want you to be able to build connectors to whatever system you need to be able to either read data from or write data to. And you should focus on that. You should be an expert in that system. You should know that system's APIs. But you don't need to be an expert in SiteCore. You don't need to know how everything in SiteCore works, because the majority of what you do and what you need to do doesn't involve SiteCore. So these are the 4 goals, and I will be trying to come back to these goals as I go through and show you what the product looks like. This is the first in what is planned to be a series of Hangouts that cover the data exchange framework. So today we're going to be focusing on how do you use it, how do you install it, how do you configure it. But then some of the later Hangouts that we have are going to cover how do you build providers. What are the techniques that you use? What are the different classes and the APIs you use? So we'll constantly be calling back to these 4 goals because these are the things that we tried to preserve and maintain and encourage with this product.
So I like the point about minimal SiteCore expertise and your point about being an expert in the system that you're an expert. What connectors are we going to support to start, right? So what are some of those systems of expertise that we are going to start with?
So by default, when you get the data exchange framework, and we'll see this when I go through and do the installation, you get a provider or connector for SiteCore. Of course, that will let you interact with SiteCore. We also have a provider for Dynamic CRM that will allow you to interact with Dynamic CRM. So you're able to do things like read and write contacts and leads and accounts and campaigns, those sorts of things. Our connector for Dynamics AX, Microsoft's commerce system, we also have a provider for their product catalog. So those are the ones that we have today, and we're always looking at additional providers that we would want to build, but we also want to encourage partners and customers to be able to build connectors for the systems that they use. And that, again, is one of the main reasons why we're having these Hangouts, so that we can really get deep down into what it takes to build those connectors, so that we can get a good, thriving ecosystem of these providers.
So that's a good dovetail into the types of systems that they may want to connect into. And maybe we'll talk about it from the other perspective. When we talk about sharing, say, CRM data, campaign data, event data, transaction data, there could be some overlap. We think of folks like Informatica or Scribe come to mind. Talk a bit about maybe similarities, differences, or what, would someone write a connector to Informatica?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with Scribe or Informatica, these are these productized, service-oriented products that allow you to map data between systems. So in a way, what Data Exchange Framework is very similar to what those products do. But the value of those products is that they have a huge set of pre-built connectors for these different systems. So right out of the box, you can get integration to things like Salesforce and Oracle and SAP and different systems like that. It makes a lot of sense to build a provider for data exchange framework to hook into something like Informatica or Scribe, because by doing that, you'll instantly get the connectivity from SiteCore over to those systems. So there is a bit of overlap when we talk about specific providers. So I mentioned that we have built and we support and maintain a provider for Dynamic CRM. Scribe and Informatica also have connectors for Dynamic CRM. So if your only requirement is to get data from Dynamic CRM into SiteCore, Data Exchange Framework is probably going to be enough for you. But if you have a requirement where there are multiple systems that you need to get data into SiteCore from, and you don't want to build connectors for these other systems, then something like Scribe or Informatica makes a lot of sense. If you spend the time and just build a connector from SiteCore to Scribe, then you'll be able to instantly get all of those connectors.
That's an important distinction. Well described. And since we're talking about the let's call it a profile or a profile attribute in the other systems in this case, you mentioned the term provider. How does this connect to a data provider, right? When we're talking about SiteCore specific items, campaigns, content.
Yep. So data providers, the idea of a data provider in SiteCore is it gives you a way to represent data as SiteCore items in a SiteCore database. That's all. If you're building a custom data provider, there's a lot of other work that you need to do. And a prime example is mapping data. So a data provider doesn't do that for you. It gives you an API so that you can map data so that your third-party data, whether it's a news article or product information, can be represented as a SiteCore item, but you still have to write the code that maps the product description from the product in the PIM to a field on the SiteCore item. And there's a lot of development that's necessary for that. Where Data Exchange Framework comes in is Data Exchange Framework could actually be used by a data provider to handle that mapping. So your data provider would be responsible for making the connection to the third-party system, but then you would use the Data Exchange Framework to map the values from the third-party system onto the template in SiteCore, which makes for a much more configuration-oriented data provider than you would normally have, because normally you would have to do that all through custom code. And that means if you want to support another field in SiteCore from the product. So let's say you have a new field on the product that represents its availability. In a regular standard SiteCore data provider, you would have to go into code and write the code that maps that availability value from the product to the SiteCore template. With the data exchange framework, it's all configuration.
Okay, that's excellent. So we're looking now at a different role, a different audience to do a configuration, a mapping. But more importantly, we're now talking about, say, the field sets that would either be specific to an Informatica, the field sets that would be specific to any other marketing app or data provision app. Those field sets will be unique, again, like you mentioned, to that product, where you're looking at configuration in SiteCore versus code in SiteCore.
Yep.
So when Adam first introduced this to me, I was incredibly excited about the possibilities for that, for partners, customers to reliably see a connector or invest in a connector that would be, say, forward-thinking, forward-proof, so that if someone does, say, add a new field, or if you add a new field to your customer experience set, that you can adapt it and, more importantly, exchange it as quickly as possible. So without further ado, Adam, I'm sure the gang is probably looking to see something in action. So I'm going to go ahead and offer you to turn that over. Yep. And while you're setting that up, which version of this is this compatible with?
So the data exchange framework is compatible with SiteCore 8.1 and higher. And what I'm going to be using here is a fresh install of SiteCore 8.2. So again, you can use SiteCore 8.1. All I've done is installed SiteCore. So I'm going to take you through the whole process from downloading, installing, configuring, and running. So the first thing I need to do is I need to download the product. So to download the product, I'm going to go to dev.sitecore.net. And if I go over to the all download section, I can scroll down here and I will find Data Exchange Framework. So we're recording this on November 8th, 2016. So we are currently on version 1.1. So I'm going to download a couple of these packages. First package is the framework itself. And I'm just going to download these directly into the packages folder on my SiteCore server, just so I don't have to upload the packages. So that's the data exchange framework itself. That gives us the basic components. In order to do anything with the data exchange framework, you need to have providers. So we have a SiteCore provider, which allows you to interact with SiteCore. So I'm going to download that. And we do have a hotfix for the SiteCore provider, which I'm going to download as well. Okay, so that is the basic product. I've got that downloaded. Now I'm going to go into SiteCore and I'm going to install those packages. Okay, so very standard SiteCore installation. I'm going to go into the control panel, under administration, install a package. And I'm going to choose a package. The order that you install these packages is important. So you do need to be careful. You want to read the installation instructions, install the data exchange framework first. That package does need to be installed first. Gives you some version requirements. And then it'll take just a moment or two for the package to install.
So we know that you're taking us really at the ground floor to show us where we download it, where we install it. Who do you anticipate, or who's the target audience for doing this configuration?
So I imagine that the configuration that we're going to go through is going to be done by a developer or a SiteCore administrator. It's a little bit of a technical process currently. As you'll see when we go through it, you do need somebody who understands the systems that they're interacting with, that understands a little bit about the data. Once you have the initial configuration set up, however, that's when non-developers are able to go in and make changes. So to go back to the example I used in the product information. If there's a new field in the product that you want to bring into SiteCore, after you have the initial configuration set up, you don't need to bring a developer back to make that change. At that point, anybody can go in and just add in a new field.
Got it.
Okay. So first package is done. That's the framework. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install the SiteCore provider. So pick the provider. Okay, gives me some information in the README here, especially important. You need to install the data exchange framework first. We know that we have that installed, so now we are installing the package. And this one should be a little quicker. There's not as much in this package as there is in the framework itself.
So folks may know I've talked certainly about, say, Commerce Connect in the past. XConnect is something we're very anxious for that's coming up. This seems to be kind of right in line with that, or are they going to be best friends with XConnect as data exchange framework matures?
Yeah, so what XConnect is going to make it a whole lot easier for you to be able to get third-party data into SiteCore, specifically XDB, and to get XDB data out of SiteCore and into third-party systems. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't handle things like data mapping. So if you want to get third-party data into XConnect, you have to write an application that's going to be able to convert that data into a format that's compatible with XConnect. Where the data exchange framework fits in is it can handle the mapping. So you can go in and you can define the mapping, and that way the code that you have to write only has to be aware of that third-party system. So you don't have to know the SiteCore APIs. You just hook into the data exchange framework, you make your data available, and then it'll be able to get pulled in through XConnect. And we'll definitely be able to have future sessions on how data exchange framework and XConnect coexist, because it's going to be a big time saver, and it's going to really answer a lot of questions that people have about XConnect once they're able to see XConnect and start using it.
And you've brought up this term consistency, so just to put more context around that, what you're building is the consistent means of mapping, leveraging, and associating the data we're getting from other systems, whether that's coming from XConnect, Commerce Connect, et cetera, that this is really the standard, the consistent and standard place for us to apply and map and use the information that's coming. So again, whether we're using XConnect, whether we're using Commerce Connect or CRM Connect, data exchange framework provides a consistent sort of translator or the area where all of that data gets mapped and applied to SiteCore objects, SiteCore items, and SiteCore profiles.
Exactly. So what we try to do is and we'll see this in the configuration, the way that you break the problem down, the idea that you have to read data from a system and you can go through that data. That's very consistent regardless of what system you use. So what the data exchange framework does is it allows you to kind of model that flow once and then just point to whatever systems you want to pull the data from and map the values from the objects in those different systems.
Makes a lot of sense. And to that point, that's where you can determine if you do have multiple systems, which say flag or attribute that you do want to populate the SiteCore one. So for example, first name, last name can come from one, and most recent event could be a condition across 3 or 4 different systems.
Exactly. So when I get into the configuration, we can do an example very similar to that. So just one last package to install, and that is that hotfix package. Okay, so now we've got all the packages installed. And what I want to do is I want to just go over into SiteCore and just show you what this is going to look like after you have the basic components installed. So I'm going to go into the content editor, and under here I've got a new node called Data Exchange. And in here I have the ability to create a tenant, an empty data exchange tenant. So that's what I'm going to do in a minute. But before I do that, I want to just kind of talk through the scenario that I want to implement here. And it's going to be a really simple scenario. What I want to do is I'm going to have a text file. And let me can create the text file here. Okay, so I'm going to just have a text file here. And what I want to do is put in some person information. So I'll call this.
This is your source. You've installed the packages for a framework, installed the providers. Now we're essentially creating the source that we're going to connect those providers to.
Yes.
Yep.
So let's say we've just got some person information. We've got ID. We'll have first name and last name. And I'll put this, put my Twitter handle here, first name Adam, last name Conn, and I'll use Nate. You're at Nate Barad, right, Nate?
Correct.
Nate Barad. Okay, so it's just a very simple comma-separated file. And I'm going to save this file onto my SiteCore server. Just call this people.csv. Very simple file. What I want to do is I want to take the information from this file and I want to create SiteCore items out of this data. So over in SiteCore, I need to have a template to store that information. So down under user defined, I'm just going to create a new template. Call this external person. And create a field for first name, last name, and for identifier. Okay, so now I have this template. I'm going to just create a folder where I can put these items. So nothing special here. I'm just going to pick a folder and call this internal people. Now I've got a place where I'm able to find the people. So I want to take the people from that file, parse that file, and create items using that data. So what I need to do is I need to configure the data exchange framework to be able to do that. Now on the target system is going to be SiteCore, and I've installed the SiteCore Provider, so that's handled. What I don't have installed already though is a provider that's able to read information from a file. So for that, I'm going to download a provider from GitHub. So over in GitHub, if I do a search for data exchange, we've got a project called sitecore.dataexchange.examples. This is a project which is a sample provider for data exchange framework. Specifically, it's a provider that lets you read from text files. So if I come in here, there's a SiteCore packages folder, and in here, there is a file system provider for data exchange framework zip. I'm going to download this because this is another provider. This is a sample provider that's going to let me read from the file system. So I'm going to save that. And back over in SiteCore, I'm going to open my installation wizard, and I'm going to install that file system provider. So after this package is done being installed, I'm going to have two separate providers, one for files and one for SiteCore. So this is going to give me the ability to read data from a file and create SiteCore items from that information. So to start to configure the data exchange framework, I need to go back to my data exchange item under system, and I'm going to create an empty data exchange tenant. Hangout tenant. The name that we give this isn't very important, just something that we can keep track of it. Now, when we create this new item, you'll see that there's a whole structure that's created underneath that. So all of the different components that we need in order to model the exchange of data between these systems is exposed. And we'll get into more detail on what each of these different items mean in some later Hangouts, because there's a lot to this framework. We're going to just try to stick to a simple example here. So I'm going to just focus on what we need in order to implement our scenario of being able to read records from a file and create SiteCore items out of it. We're going to start with endpoints. Endpoints represent a source of data or a target of data. So under endpoints, I've got common endpoints and I've got providers. I'm going to go down to providers because this will show me the different providers that I have installed and will allow me to create a folder that I can group similar endpoints together. So I'm going to select File System Endpoints root. This is just going to give me a folder called File System. The purpose of this folder is to organize the endpoints that represent files. So in that folder, I've got an endpoint called Text File Endpoint. So I'm going to just call this my people CSV file, because that's what this endpoint really is. And then, since this is an endpoint that represents a file, I need to provide information that is able to describe that file. The most important piece of information being the path to the file. So the path to the file, you've got two options. This can be a relative path, relative from the web root of your SiteCore server, or it can be an absolute path. So I'm going to go into, bring up Windows Explorer here. And this is the web root of my SiteCore server, not DataX, it is Hangout. So in here, I'm actually going to move people because I accidentally saved people in another web root. I need to move that over to Hangout because that's the SiteCore instance I'm on. But now I've got that file in the web root. So since it is in the web root, all I have to do is just put in the name of the file, people CSV. Now this is an endpoint. If we remember the name of the template, text file endpoint. So this represents a text file. So in order to read from a text file, you're probably going to have different columns that are separated by some character. By default, the separator is a comma. You may have a tab, you may have other characters. You can use those in here. But for my file, it is a comma separated file, which let me bring this up again. So we're in here, got website. So this is my file. It is comma separated. And then the next option is the first line in the file, does it have column headers? And yes, in this text file, the first line is the column headers. So what this option allows us to do is just to tell SiteCore, ignore the data that's in the first line of the file because that doesn't represent a person.
Mm-hmm.
So I just saved
across a lot of apps. Yep.
Yep. So I just saved this, and now I've got an endpoint that represents the source system that I want to read from. Now, I also need to identify the system that I want to write to, and I want to write to SiteCore. So just like when the source system was a file system, I needed to use the file system provider to define that endpoint. The target system is SiteCore, so I need to use the SiteCore provider for that. So I come in here, after I create the SiteCore folder, I can see the different endpoint options that are available from the SiteCore provider. Now the SiteCore provider is more sophisticated than the file system provider because there are different types of data that we can read from and write to. So we can read and write XDB contacts, we can interact with SiteCore campaigns, and we can interact with SiteCore items. I want to take this data from the file and I want to write it into SiteCore items. So I need a SiteCore item model repository endpoint. And after I create this endpoint, there aren't any options on here that I need to specify. The endpoint knows what it needs to do. It knows how to interact with SiteCore items. So here's what I've configured. I've gone into endpoints. I've defined my source endpoint, which is the CSV file, and I've got my target endpoint, which is the SiteCore item model repository. Next thing I want to do is I want to describe the different data that I'm going to be reading from the CSV file. Okay, so the CSV file, I have those couple of values, the identifier, the first name, and the last name. So I'm going to define those within SiteCore. So to do this, I'm going to go into the data access section and go into value accessor sets. And once again, everything is organized by provider so I can keep things straight. And this is going to be really important later on when I need to identify what mappings I want to use. So in here, under providers, I'm going to create a file system folder again. So file system. And I have something called a value accessor set. And the idea of the value accessor set is this is going to represent the different components that are used to read values from file. So I'm going to create this, and I'm going to call this value accessor set for CSV file. So under here, I'm going to have a value accessor for each of the values that I want to read from the file. So this is representing a column from the file. So first one, I'm going to call this the ID. And now this is asking me for a position. So this position is going to be relative to the column in the file. Okay, so this is the first position. The identifier represents the first position. So I'm going to save that. That's all I need to do. I'm going to create another one for first name, which is the second position. And I'm going to have last name, which is the third position. So now I've just defined the format or the structure of the source data. Okay, so this maps or matches what I have here. Next thing I need to do is the same sort of thing, but for the SiteCore item. So this represents the source object that I'm reading. Next thing I want to do is I want to represent the target object. Folder, again, I need a root for SiteCore. So this creates a SiteCore folder. And there are two types of data that I'm able to write to SiteCore here. One is to use SiteCore items, and the other is to write to XDB contacts. I want to create SiteCore items from the data, so I'm going to create a SiteCore item set, and I'm going to call this external person. And maybe just to be consistent, call this value accessor set for external person. Now within this set, just like I had to define the different columns in the CSV file, I have to define the different fields on the SiteCore item. Okay, so first field is going to be, call this first name. And I need to pick a field. So here, I am going to find my template and find the field in the template for first name. Okay. So depending on the system that you're trying to map to, you're going to have different options. When I'm reading from a CSV file, I've got to specify the position in the row that I want to read. For an item that represents a field on a SiteCore item, you have a field called field where you select the field in the template. So I need to do this for last name. Same sort of thing, find the field in the template and select it. And do the same thing for identifier. Save this.
And while you're saving and going through, I don't want to stop the flow, but just to make note of what I'm assuming we'll get into is the reuse, right? Because we're treating this at such a discrete and component level, I'll just make the comment here and we'll dive into it later. Everything you're doing can then be reused as this is what we're calling the first name, or this is what we're in the SiteCore endpoint. And then this is also a different endpoint we can use as a source, perhaps for something else. So by doing it this way, the amount, again, of standard reuse is evident.
Absolutely. That is the entire point of this, that you may look at it and think, well, this is a lot of configuration for something that I could hard code. Yeah, that may be true, but once you hard code it, now if I add a new field to that file and a new field to the template, I just have to go in and do a little bit of configuration and it's working. Furthermore, like you were just talking about, Nate, this mapping is going to be the same approach that I use if I'm reading from a file, if I'm reading from SiteCore items, if I'm reading from a CRM, if I'm reading from a PIM, any kind of system I want to interact with, I use the same structure. So what we've done here is we have defined the structure of the data from the source system and from the target system. Next thing we do is we define the mapping. So the mapping is where we connect the first name from the CSV file to the first name on the template. So to do this, we're going to go down to another section, which is the value mapping sets section. And in here, I'm going to create a new value mapping set. And the mapping set is going to be CSV file to external person items. And in here, I define as many value mappings as I want. So we'll call this one first name mapping. And on this item, there are really two main fields that I'm interested in, source and the target. What is the component used to read the value from the source object? Well, I'm going to go into my value accessors. And for first name, I'm going to pick first name from the CSV file value accessor set. What do I want to do with that value? I want to write it to the SiteCore item. So I go into the SiteCore value accessors and pick first name for the item. This is how we do mapping. Okay, so I'm going to do this for last name mapping. Okay, so same thing, come in here, find my file system value for last name, and find my SiteCore item field for last name. And I'm going to do one for identifier mapping. Again, go to the file system and get that ID column. And for SiteCore, go in and pick the identifier field. So now we've got the mapping. Okay, so what we've done, just to review, we've defined the endpoints. The endpoints represent where the source objects are coming from and where the target objects are going to. We have defined the structure of the source object. That's here, the value accessor set. All of the different columns that we read from the file is represented, each is represented by a separate SiteCore item. And then for the target object where we want to write the values to, we also define that structure. So for each field that we want to set on the SiteCore item, we have these different items. And then we have the mapping. And the mapping is where we draw the line, where we connect the file system value accessor to the SiteCore item value accessor. So we've done a lot of mapping and defining things, but we haven't described how the logic is going to run. What starts the process? How do we know where we want to read from? How do we connect the endpoint to these different value accessors? So now we're going to talk about how we configure the flow of logic. And we do this through pipelines. So pipelines are familiar to you if you're a SiteCore developer. The pipelines that we use here are conceptually the same thing as what you have with a regular SiteCore pipeline, but instead of these pipelines being configured through XML, they're configured through SiteCore items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a pipeline that represents the logic of reading the text file. Okay, so this pipeline is going to be read CSV file. When I create this pipeline, I've got pipeline steps, and I can see the insert options are set with all of these different options. These options will depend on what providers you have installed. So I have the SiteCore Provider installed, and I have the file system provider installed, so I'm going to have those options. So what I want to do is I want to read from a file. So I've got a pipeline step in here called read text file, pipeline step. So I'm going to pick this. Don't need to change the name. And if I want to read a text file, I need to pick an endpoint, a file system endpoint. So in here, when I go to pick an endpoint, it's going to show me only the endpoints that represent file system endpoints. That's how the provider is set up. So
and then, to plug it in, this is where we can reuse all those components in a given different flow, right? Where we might put a programmatic step in to say, for example, most recent event, most recent engagement, most recent purchase. That could come across a number of different providers, but then we would do that logic in the pipeline.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. So first step is that we are going to read the text file. Now, the way that this pipeline step works, it's going to read the text file, and it puts the data from the file into the context, into the pipeline context. So then the next step is going to have access to it. So the next step, I'm going to save this. Save that guy, okay. And now the next step is going to be responsible for looping through that data that was read. And the next step is going to be the step, iterate data and run pipeline step. Okay, so this is going to, I'm going to just name this iterate rows in the CSV file, because that's what this does. It's going to go through each row in the file, and for each row, it's going to pass that row to another pipeline. So I'm going to need another pipeline, and this pipeline is going to handle a single row. Create a new pipeline, call this handle single row from CSV. So back over here, when I iterate rows in the CSV file, for each row, I want to call the handle single row from CSV. Okay, so see what's happening here? We've got the first step, which is read text file. So that's going to read the data from the CSV file. Then the next step, which I need to make sure it's in the right order. Next step is going to handle each row from that CSV file. And for each row, it's going to pass that row over to this other pipeline. So now what does this other pipeline do? This other pipeline is going to get a row. So if we go back over to our text file, the row is going to have this data. We're going to have access to this data. So we need to check to see if a SiteCore item already exists that matches this record. Because if the item already exists, we want to update the item. If it doesn't exist, we want to create the item. So over in this pipeline, first thing I want to do is I'm going to resolve a SiteCore item. So there's a pipeline step called resolve SiteCore item. I'm going to do that. And now on this pipeline step, there are a few options, because there's kind of a lot that needs to happen in order for us to figure out, is there a SiteCore item that matches this record? So I'll just go through them in the order that they appear. First one is the template for the new item. So if we need to create a new SiteCore item, what template do we want to use? Well, we want to use external person. Whenever you create a new SiteCore item, you always have to specify an item name. So what do we want to use for the item name? Well, we have access to the values from the file. So why don't we just use the first name? You know, the data is not great for using this, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to use first name. How do I get to the first name? Well, I've got this item, this value accessor that defines the position in that record. This is saying it's that second column. So that's going to give me the item name. What is the endpoint that I want to read data from? Well, remember what I'm doing here is I'm looking to see if there's a SiteCore item that already exists. So I need to pick a SiteCore item endpoint. And I only have one. I pick that. Now the identifier section. The identifier section is where we specify the settings that are used to determine if an item already exists. So the only data we have to work with is this data here. So I'm going to use the ID, the identifier, as the primary key for the SiteCore items. Okay, so for the value accessor, I'm going to read the ID value from the file. The identifier object is the source object. So I want to read the value from the source object. I want to read the ID value from the source object. Under object resolution, things like if the object isn't resolved, don't create a new object. This is useful if you don't want to create data, you only want to update existing data. We don't want to do that. But we do need to specify where we want the resolved object to go. So what we're going to do is if the item doesn't exist in SiteCore, a new item is going to be created, but that item is going to be created in memory for a little while. So the memory location is going to be the target. So this is just it's a context, like if you think of regular SiteCore pipelines, you have the ability to store things in memory as you go from one pipeline processor to another. Same thing here. So we're just going to store that temporary SiteCore item as the target object. And this is really important because after we set this, now we've got two objects set on the context. We've got the source object, which is the file system object, and we've got the target object, which is the SiteCore item. Okay. Now, when we do a lookup in SiteCore and we're looking to see if the item exists with this ID, so we're going to look to see if there is a SiteCore item who has the identifier of my Twitter handle. Where do I want to look? Where do I want to start my search? That's external people. That's why I created that folder, because that's where I want these items to be stored. And then what value accessor do I want to use on the SiteCore item to match the value that we've identified here? So this is going to be the SiteCore field whose value I want to match. So this is identifying the value on the SiteCore item to do the match on. Okay. So now, at the end of this step, we have either gotten an existing SiteCore item and put it in the context as a target, or we have created a new item and set that new item as the target. So now we've got the source object and the target object. Next thing we want to do, map data between those. We want to take the values from the source object and write them to the target object. That's why we defined this thing down here. So this is where we use this configuration. So I've got a pipeline step to apply mappings. I've defined the mappings. Now I need to apply the mappings. So I'm going to call this apply mappings from CSV row to SiteCore item. And for here, all I need to do is just pick my mapping set. Okay. This is the mapping set that I configured. I only have one. I'll save this. Be careful of the order of these pipeline steps because I need these to go in this particular order. At the end of this step, now I've got the target object has been updated. The values have been mapped. So the last thing we need to do is we need to save that item back into SiteCore. So we've got a pipeline step called update SiteCore item. And all we need to do here is just pick the SiteCore item model repository, that endpoint, the SiteCore endpoint, so that this step knows it's got an object that it wants to write to SiteCore. Where exactly does it get written? Save that. Also be sure to change the order so that the order goes resolve the SiteCore item, map the values, and then update the item in SiteCore. Save the item to SiteCore. So now we've got this, we've got our pipelines defined. Next thing I need to do is I need to configure something called a pipeline batch, because the pipeline batch is the object we use to run the synchronization. So I'm just going to create a new pipeline batch, and I'll call this CSV to SiteCore item sync process. And in here, I am able to select the pipelines that I want to run. And I want to run the pipeline called read CSV file, because this pipeline is going to call this other pipeline. So this is really what I want to run. Now, the reason why I create this thing called a pipeline batch is because the pipeline batch gives us something that we can run. It gives us an object that we can use to store some runtime information. And a pipeline doesn't. A pipeline is just settings. So this is you can almost think of this as a small, lightweight application that's able to run a pipeline. So save this item. And then the last thing I need to do, because you may notice here that I've got the pipeline batch selected, and I've got a button up here called Run Pipeline Batch, but the button is not enabled. The reason for this is because the tenant is not enabled. So if I select the tenant, go into administration, by default, when you create a new tenant, it is not enabled. This is for your own good. This is to make sure that none of the synchronization processes that you define run until you are sure that they are configured properly. So after I enable the tenant, now I can go into the pipeline batch and I can run the pipeline batch. Tells me the process has started. Down here, I can see some debugging information. And in here, I can see the last time it was started, last time it finished, and I can see a message. Okay, so pipeline batch processing will abort because none of the pipelines assigned to the batch are enabled. Okay, so let's come in here. This one is enabled. This one is not enabled. So I need to enable that. Let's run this again. And now this is a very simple synchronization process. The file is very small, so the synchronization is going to happen really fast. And I can see here 2 rows were read from the file, 2 elements were iterated. If I come up to external people, I've got my people. I can go in and change the file. Add another record. Run the batch again. This time, 3 elements were iterated. And so just hasn't flushed out the items yet, but eventually we will see that 3rd item is created. And that is the data exchange framework.
Awesome, thank you. So just in wrap up, that's super helpful to see the configuration, especially my biggest takeaway was the componentization, that we're going to set this up once. Doesn't seem too tremendously difficult to set up, but the most important thing is once it is set up, you now have a base of sources and destinations for endpoints and a definition of what the different fields and attributes are going to mean. So this is really just the beginning of integrating with other systems. As we move forward, Adam, is the configuration going to look similar? Excuse me, is it going to look the same or different in future releases?
Yeah, so today you can see that the configuration is all done through SiteCore items, which is a vast improvement over config files. Just imagine trying to configure this through config files and trying to figure out when you have a misspelled word. It's really difficult. So the SiteCore items do give us some big advantages, such as having some user interface validation and some nice user interface options, but still this isn't ideal. And in the future, we are going to have a UI that allows us to do this more visually. So we can do things like drag and drop. We can display a list of the available values and objects from the source and target system, so you don't have to know what they are and go in and do it all manually. So that'll be coming. But today it is done through SiteCore items. There are a lot of parts to it. There are a lot of pieces to it, and we just scratched the surface of it in this Hangout. In future Hangouts, we're going to go into more detail on what the different options are on these different objects. And we're going to talk about how you can build a provider and how do you extend what's there and how do you create your own completely new components.
Super way to conclude. And as Adam mentioned, we'll be introducing more topics on the Hangouts for Data Exchange Framework, and we'll probably bring along some other guest speakers and guest presenters. So once again, Adam, thanks a lot for kicking us off today. It is just the beginning for us exploring the Data Exchange Framework as well as other integrations, more formalized integrations to other products. So the recording, of course, will be on our YouTube Live channel, and keep a lookout for the next session. Adam, any closing?
Just thank you and Darth for joining today. And I think there were a few comments and questions that came up during the presentation. We are out of time, but I'm going to respond to those on Twitter so we can continue the conversation then. And just be on the lookout for more of these sessions, and hope to see you then. So have a good one, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everyone.